Welcome to this week's edition of Flashback Friday, your opportunity to get some good review by listening to episodes from the past that Jason has handpicked to help you today in the present and propel you into the future. Enjoy.
Speakers, publishers, consultants, coaches, and info marketers unite. The Speaking of Wealth show is your roadmap to success and significance. Learn the latest tools, technologies, and tactics to get more bookings, sell more products, and attract more clients. If you're looking to increase your direct response sales, create a big-time personal brand, and become the go-to guru, the Speaking of Wealth show is for you. Here's your host, Jason Hartman.
Welcome to the Speaking of Wealth show. This is your host, Jason Hartman, where we discuss profit strategies for speakers, publishers, authors, consultants, coaches, info marketers, and just go over a whole bunch of exciting things that you can use to increase your business, to make your business more successful and more passive and more automated and more scalable. So we will be back with a great interview. Be sure to visit us at speakingofwealth.com. You can take advantage of our blog, subscribe to the RSS feed, and many other resources for free at speakingofwealth.com. And we will be back with a great interview for you in less than 60 seconds.
Here's your chance to catch up on all of those Creating Wealth shows that you've missed. There's a 3-book set with shows 1 through 60, all digital download. You save $94 by buying this 3-book set. Go ahead and get these advanced strategies for wealth creation. For more details, go to jasonhartman.com.
My pleasure to welcome Mark Murphy to the show. He's coming to us from Atlanta today, and he is the author of Hiring for Attitude and the CEO of Leadership IQ. And he is doing a bit of a specialty nowadays, I guess, in the subject of remote employee management, remote employee leadership. He's got an incredible resume, which includes Harvard Business School lectures, Yale, et cetera, and lots of media exposure as well. So it's a pleasure to have Mark on the show today. And Mark, welcome. How are you?
Oh, great. Thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. So tell us a little bit about your background first, and then let's get into some real specific, usable concepts and techniques for remote employee management.
Sure. My life is these days basically spent trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. I realized long ago that if we just looked at management practices and tried to come up with, what was going to sound neat from the guru perspective, that didn't work so much. What we tried to figure out is what actually works and does not work in the real world and basically disseminate that information. We do it through webinars and seminars and books and all the rest. But really it comes down to what does the research show works? What practices actually work in the real world? And that's what we do. And remote employees, given the flattening of today's organizations, given that some of your best people may be 12-hour time zone away from you, we've got to figure out better ways of creating organizations that still maintain culture, still maintain alignment, even when you're managing people that could be thousands of miles away from you.
Sure. And I have a hidden agenda here on this interview, Mark, so I hope you don't mind. It's not really hidden. But I want to learn about how to manage my own businesses better. And I'll just tell you that I have redesigned them substantially over the last several years. And, one of the influences, frankly, was reading The 4-Hour Workweek. You're probably familiar with that book. And I used to have big offices, big staff, high overhead, lots of stress, and frankly, lots of babysitting, managing office politics and so forth. And, in the past few years, I've really virtualized a lot of my business. I have remote workforces. So far, I've only had good luck with U.S.-based remote employees or contractors. I have tried India and the Philippines without success at all. I've been very disappointed trying to do the offshoring low-wage concept. Just has not worked for me at all. I guess it must work for some people. But, I'm just looking for what can I learn about it? And a lot of our listeners, I think, have really kind of developed a new identity as to what having a small to medium-sized business means nowadays. And certainly people in the big corporate world as well, dealing with remote employees, just like you said.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the big things that people have to grapple with is the kind of work they're actually trying to take outside of the organization and trying to bring remote. So, for example, there's some work it's very discrete. It has a very distinct beginning and an end point. And basically, one of the things we found is the more discrete the work, the easier it is to bring outside of the U.S. The less discrete the work, the harder it is to bring outside the U.S. So, for example, if you're trying to take work that involves coordination of people, if it involves getting sources of input from one place and another and melding that together, that's not very discrete. It's not one person doing one task that is really localized, on their desktop. They have to interface, they have to coordinate. That kind of work is tougher to get offshore. Whereas work, if you need to have an illustration done for, a proposal you're putting together or something like that, that's pretty easy to take to India or the Philippines or China, where have it. It doesn't so much matter. Very discrete work, that can be, I need 3 macros written that do X, Y, Z, or I need a subroutine written that does this, this, and this. That stuff is very easy to offshore, but generally what we found is a lot of organizations really struggle with bringing any kind of coordinating function outside of the U.S. And so it's, even when you think about remote work, there's so many different kinds of work that companies do. Some of it is very outsourceable and virtualizable, and other pieces of work just aren't. There's always going to be something that there is a face-to-face communication, for example, absolutely has its place. But the more we can actually distinguish between the kinds of work we're supposed to be doing, then it starts to become clear. You know what? Some of this can be brought overseas. But somebody in the U.S. typically is still going to end up coordinating that work.
Yeah, and that seems to be the way it goes with the offshoring world. I mean, the U.S. is still very good at project management or coordination, I'd say. And, it's interesting because on every Apple product, it says designed in Cupertino, California, made in China. And, that's certainly not an uncommon concept, of course, but Apple always sort of bills it that way, and others don't. They just say made in China. And I think that's very true. The U.S. still really has a very powerful place in the world in terms of creativity and initiative. And for all the great things about manufacturing in China and doing programming in India and call centers in the Philippines or Costa Rica, the U.S. really just culturally has a certain something about it that really gives it a major, major edge. With so much beating up on the U.S. nowadays, and, I do it too, and it's sad to see all these jobs go offshore in many ways, but I don't think America could be replicated too easily in the areas in which it really still leads.
No, and that's the real the real critical element is to figure out, again, what kinds of work should be going remotely and what kinds aren't. And the other thing is to think about it that when it's the very task-based kind of work, there is a tendency for managers to think that if I take this remote, that means it's less management time for me. And one of the critical things we have seen with the most successful organizations doing the whole remote workforce thing is that it doesn't save management time. What taking work outside of the organization can do, what having a remote workforce can do, is sometimes it can be less expensive, but it can also, the more important benefit, even that's not the primary benefit. The primary benefit is that it widens your access to talent. If you're sitting in Ottumwa, Iowa, that's not going to give you access to the kinds of quality technological help, for example, that you'd get if you were sitting in the Bay Area in California. But with a remote workforce, you can access that same level of talent. And the critical mistake I see organizations make is when they think, this is going to save me management time. And the reality is that if you want high-performing remote workers, it's still going to take management time. It changes. You're not doing face-to-face meetings and all of that, but they still have to be coordinated. They still have to be aligned. You still have to check in with them every day. It's just, it gives you, A, a bigger pool of talent, and B, you don't need as much office space and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. And it ends about a zillion problems too. It does create some new ones, but think about it. In the traditional workforce, you have the problem of the office politicking issues. You have safety concerns, workers' comp concerns, OSHA concerns, legal concerns like sexual harassment or any type of harassment. And I found that when I had the big offices and the staff right there, I was dealing with a lot more, frankly, babysitting type issues and dealing with a lot of those issues, which really sucked up a lot of productive time, in my opinion. You trade one set of problems for another, no question about it. But how can you trust remote employees? And I guess this is less true if they're a contractor and you're paying them for actual piecework type of pay-for-play type of pay, which, of course, every employer loves because it's not fixed cost. But if they're an employee especially, how do you know, how can you trust them? How do you know that they're actually working?
It's one of the things, and you raised this a minute ago with the, getting rid of some of the office politics stuff. One of the things that having remote employees does is it forces you to really think through the outcomes of the work. It's one of the reasons I love the issue of the remote workforce is that it forces a kind of clarity that often companies just kind of skate past, they take for granted. So, for example, you have to think through more carefully, well, what are the deadlines? What are the expected outcomes? At what point do I want these projects to be completed? And it allows for a more outcome-based kind of management as opposed to an hours-based kind of management. So we become less concerned with how many hours, how many minutes are people sitting at their desk? Are they, staring off into space? Are they actually working? And we become more concerned with what was actually accomplished. Was it correct? Was it not correct? Did it meet a deadline, et cetera? And in doing that, if we focus our work on, I want to make sure that everybody's working every minute of the day. There are technologies, for example, in Odesk, one of the, the great contractor management systems out there, marketplace for finding independent contractors. One of their great innovations was utilizing technology that when somebody's working on your behalf, they have to sign into the system, and it gives you screenshots as they're going throughout the day. And there were certainly plenty of systems like that where people have to log in.
And I looked at Odesk, by the way, because, when you're paying someone hourly, you want to know that they're working. Now, of course, they could be playing a game on the other computer on their desk or, surfing Facebook, most certainly. But, you have to give them a percentage of the pay. And that can get pretty expensive, I would think. It could also almost negate the purpose. At least that's the way it works with Odesk. What are some of the other ones? You said Marketplace. Is that another one? I'm not familiar with that.
No, there's a number of them that basically do the same thing. There's about 50 different technologies we've seen that allow you to basically monitor, sort of remotely monitor what your folks are doing. But I'll tell you honestly, what we found works even better than that, even better than the monitoring system. Although I will say, too, if you use a system, and depending, if you're part of a big corporation, you'll have some kind of an instant messaging system typically. Although, if you're on using the Google Enterprise services, there is a chat function that you can use that you can just pull up and call somebody via a webcam chat or what have you, just a voice chat even, or text chat at, any point in the day. And if they respond, that tells you something right there. The single best thing we found is having outcome-based work and management as opposed to activity-based. And then, if they step away from their desk for 20 minutes at some point, if they're accomplishing the outcomes you want to see accomplished, it's one of the pluses that people like about the remote workforce is that it allows them to structure their day, structure their work, and gives them the freedom to step away for 20 minutes. Now, if it's one of those jobs where it's not so much outcome-based, but rather it's presence-based. That is, you need them to be accessible any minute of any day. Then having more frequent communications, being able to chat them, being able to pop that up at a millisecond's notice, those are the kinds of things that tend to keep people accountable. For all of the technology out there, systems that count keystrokes and all of that, there was a system years ago, and this stuff first started coming out in the 80s, that was counting keystrokes. And were people actually, typing on their computers? Were admins doing what we paid them to do? And so, they figured out a system. They would take a big heavy dictionary and put it on top of the keyboard so that the keyboards were just, it was like it was typing constantly. So you want to count letters. There's always a way to game the technology. The real issue is making sure that the management that underlies it and the communication that's in place, the relationship in place, is doing what you want it to do. If
certainly,
that's healthy, that's everything. That takes care of everything.
Yeah, and hiring right and good leadership skills, and we're going to talk about that. But before we do, Mark, hiring is so critical. So first of all, are there any hiring tools in particular that you would recommend? Certainly over the years, I've used and been familiar with the different personality assessments and things like that. Are there any great web-based hiring tools that might be especially useful for the remote workforce, for hiring and screening the remote workforce? And then, even before that, where do you find them? I use Craigslist quite extensively. The problem with Craigslist, though, is it doesn't offer any sorting capabilities, or it's certainly got the exposure to the marketplace, but it would be nice if it actually had some categories and people had to fill things out and things like. You can always refer them back to a web form that does that, but thoughts there?
Yeah, there's a number of things. There isn't a magical assessment that works for two reasons. Number one, they're easy to game. The only kinds of psychological assessments that you really can't game are the ones that have to be administered by a clinical psychologist, and then they become illegal to use from a hiring point of view because they end up with so in-depth they become a clinical diagnosis. So that's a very sketchy area. The other side of it is that every organization is a little bit different. So really what you want to do is take a look at the people that have if you just take, for example, in the past 3 months, your 3 best people and your 3 worst people, that basically tells you the characteristics right there that you're looking to hire and the characteristics you want to make sure that you don't hire. Now, with remote employees specifically, I will tell you that one universal trait we found is that people who are quiet and who are passive and who are reactive and need to be told what to do not work well in remote situations. So it's funny, it is the exact opposite of sort of the myths we've had about the remote workforce that, it's the quiet people, since they're quiet anyways, those are the people who tend to do well in remote situations. And turns out that's not actually the case. It turns out that it's the more outgoing natural networker types that do better in remote situations. And the reason is that by virtue of their abilities to build networks, whether they're remote or they're co-located, which is just the technical term for being face-to-face in an office with somebody, whether they're remote or co-located, they are able to build the kinds of relationships that are necessary to get work done in these days. And so it's the quiet loner types who are passive, who tend to withdraw, and they can sulk on occasion. They tend to need their boss to constantly tell them what to do. That is generally speaking, that is a bad personality mesh with a remote working environment. And so you really want people that have a history of being proactive, of building relationships. And the other side of it is, in a remote setting, if you're going to have somebody be a remote employee, make your first interview or two remote. Don't automatically bring people in for face-to-faces. Have it and see how it works, and give them a task to respond to. See how well they do with it. Have them go to your website and give them a couple of questions that they have to answer. See how proactive they are with that. And those are going to be some of the personality characteristics you're going to be looking for when you're talking about who works well in a remote environment.
What are some of the leadership skills, though? I mean, you've kind of touched on some, but, as a specific question, I wanted to go into that. I mean, how do you lead and manage remote workforces?
One of the things leaders have to do is they have to be much more explicit and transparent. So they have to surface issues. And they have to talk about things that a lot of leaders would take for granted. Let me give you a couple. So when you're having a conference call, let's say you're having a face-to-face meeting. In a face-to-face meeting, oftentimes you can tell if people are agreeing with you or not agreeing with you simply by their body language. Are they engaged? Are they not engaged? Are they paying attention, not paying attention? In a conference call kind of setting, you don't have that luxury. It's harder to tell if people are engaged or not engaged. And so one of the things that leaders have to do is they have to actually start asking people, all right, now, listen, I just outlined the plan for you for these past 5 minutes. So here's what I want to do. I want you to repeat back to me what you heard me say, because I want to make sure that I'm on the same page as you and you're on the same page as me here. So let's go around, everybody on the call. I want each of you to go and repeat back to me what it was I just said. And you have to do tests like this to really make sure that people heard what you wanted them to hear. Again, it's one of those issues that is being much more explicit about things. Also, being much more explicit about something we call it a level of freedom. And the level of freedom is basically how much rope does this person get? Is if I give them an assignment, am I sending them off to go assess the situation, report back to me, and then I'll decide what to do? Or am I sending them out there and saying, yeah, go assess the situation, pick a course of action, and just go do whatever you think is right? Which, and whatever levels in between there. What am I asking? How much freedom does this person actually get? It's something that managers and employees do not often talk about. But especially in co-located environments, they tend to just take that for granted. Again, the reason why is that you can walk past an employee's office and pop in and say, so where do you stand with the Johnson project? Oh, well, I was just about to send it out. No, don't send it out until I get a chance to look at it. Oh, okay. And you can just do those things and then we move past them. But in the remote space, if we don't talk about it explicitly, A, we don't get that information, and B, what ends up happening is when people work remotely, they automatically assume that there is more autonomy than there is when they're co-located. And that may not be the case at all. In fact, what we found is that most managers actually want their employees to have less autonomy, because managers start to get nervous. When their employees are remote, they start to get nervous and they start to wonder, well, what are they doing? What work are they doing? And they tend to start to check up more, which can really cause problems if the employee is presuming that, I have total autonomy, and the manager is now thinking that they're taking away autonomy. This becomes a problem. Another big issue is that when managers are assigning work, one of the things that managers often just take for granted is the why of the work. So we give an assignment, I need you to do this report, I need you to throw these analyses in. They often don't say, here's why this has to get done. Here's the client this is serving. Here's why this is important to the company. Here's why we're using this new technology. Here's whatever the why is. They often don't explain it. And then two things happen in that case. Number one is the employee misses out on that information, and it actually hampers their ability to actually get this work done and get it done effectively. The second thing is if you're trying to build a culture of remote workers, then this is one of the big complaints that remote employees have, is they often feel like they don't really understand the direction of the company. They don't really understand why we're doing things and where we're going. And this is one of the major sources of remote employee dissatisfaction, is they feel cut off from all of this information that they would normally get inside an organization. It's the why. This is a new client. They miss the fact that we're excited about this. They can't sense it. They don't get that interaction from their fellow employees. So it's something that, again, we have to be really explicit. We can't make a lot of the assumptions we make in the co-located world. In the remote world, my general rule is, if you think you shouldn't have to say something, like I shouldn't have to say that, they should already know that. If you ever say to yourself, I shouldn't have to tell somebody this, it's a safe bet in a remote environment. You have to tell them that.
Right. In other words, don't take it for granted as much as you might in a in-person environment. So good points. Let me take a brief pause. We'll be back in just a minute.
Now's your opportunity to get the Financial Freedom Report. The Financial Freedom Report provides financial self-defense in uncertain times, and it's your source for innovative, forward-thinking investment property strategies and advice. Get your newsletter subscription today. You get a digital download and even more. The price only $197. Go to jasonhartman.com to get yours today.
Well, when things go wrong, I mean, obviously retention is part of the game, and we talked a little bit about recruiting, but how about retention? I mean, what drives remote employees to quit?
When they feel disconnected from the organization's direction, when they feel disconnected from the strategy, when they feel isolated, not so much in terms of the fact that they're off doing their work, but when they feel like their work is being made more difficult because they don't have access to certain kinds of resources that they feel like other people would have access to. There's an interesting catch-22 that co-located employees tend to be jealous of remote employees because they feel like the remote employees get more autonomy. But
they probably think they're just kicking back by the pool.
Exactly. And by contrast, the remote employees are jealous of the co-located employees because they feel like the co-located employees are getting access to the boss. They're getting better opportunities. They get more face time. They're in the in-group. They have a better chance of advancement in the organization because they get more face time with the boss. And so each of the groups is actually jealous of the other group, and they're both right. Both groups have actually, identified, not that the remote employee is kicking by the pool, but there is a certain de facto autonomy that comes just from being out of sight, out of mind, but there is a very big downside to that as well. And so one of the major demotivators for the remote employee is when they feel like they are disconnected, and that means a loss of opportunities. It means a loss of education and training, and not the formal kinds of go to a seminar stuff, but the informal stuff, just having neater opportunities, having a little extra bit of coaching from the boss. They really feel like they're neglected by their bosses. They feel like they're missing out on opportunities because out of sight, out of mind, and they feel like this is going to do longer-term damage to their career. And so those are some of the bigger demotivators for the remote employee.
What you're saying, that's interesting how you pointed out how each group is jealous of the other. The employees who are in-house, the co-located ones as you call them, are jealous of the remotes, and the remotes are jealous of the in-office people, in-house people. And it reminds me of the game of love and relationships. There's two sayings about that when you're not with your significant other. Number one is out of sight, out of mind. Okay. And the other is absence makes the heart grow fonder. So, I guess both are really true, aren't they?
Exactly. It turns out that it's like, yay, I get a weekend to myself. And then
guy's weekend or girl's weekend, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But then you turn around and you go, oh, well, now I don't get to see them all weekend. And, it really is it's a double-edged sword. And one of the things that leaders really have to be careful of is thinking that, it's what I said at the beginning, is that if a manager goes into it thinking that, oh, good, they're remote, now I don't have to talk to them as much, I don't have to manage them as much, it turns out that's actually not the case. They will take every bit as much time and energy to manage. It's going to manifest itself in a different way. But if they feel disconnected, that's where that trust starts to erode, like, well, what are they doing? And then the employee's thinking, well, they don't care about me. And then the manager's thinking, well, I don't think they're really working. And without either party saying a single word to each other, their relationship can start to sour simply because of all the assumptions they're making about what the other one is or is not doing. And that's just a deadly place for a relationship to be.
Sure it is. It's amazing to me that you talked about a computer program, a software program for managing remote employees that was available back in the 80s. I mean, I had no idea that this sort of new way of working was even that old. I mean, when would you say the remote employee or the remote contractor? I mean, this whole discussion, by the way, we keep saying employees, but it really applies to both in so many ways, contractors and employees. When would you say that really was sort of in full swing? When did it begin really? I mean, in any real way?
I'm going to give you a very bizarre answer to this question, and I'm going to say about 3,000 years ago.
Oh, okay.
And the issue is that when you think about the Roman Empire, when we think about where did you have to control people who were operating on your behalf that you couldn't see for periods of time, really we're going back in history here to the great empires. And I find it particularly instructive to think about it in those terms, because what it points out is that the challenges we have nowadays, are the same challenges we had literally thousands of years ago. So we think about, it's communication breakdowns. It's my message getting misinterpreted. It's people not being proactive in responding back to me and letting me know, what new territories they've captured. It's, do they appreciate what kind of freedom I'm giving them or not giving them? Do they have the same sense of freedom that I believe they should have here? All of the same management issues we've grappled with literally for 3,000 years are the issues we grapple with today. Again, I point that out because the notion of remote management is not a new issue. We treat it like this is a brand new thing, but the reality is the same problems we've dealt with are the same problems we continue to deal with. And so in its modern day form, it's really been a function of this internet age. And really, it's bizarre to think about that there were plenty of companies that, if you take a look at 1996, for example, this is when websites were first starting to really get out there. Yeah, there were companies that had websites before that, but in terms of popular use, it wasn't a universal. Small companies, not every small company had a website in 1996, 97. This is only 10, 15 years ago we're talking about here. And so in its most modern form, it's really about the past 10 years that this remote thing in the internet and the chatting and all of that stuff has existed. But since even into the late 70s, companies have been concerned about what their employees are doing when they're not being watched. And that's where that software that came out to count keystrokes, that's where that came about. It was fundamentally about a manager wanting to know what their employees are doing. Now,
yeah, and I want to mention something about that because that's not all like, we're holding the staff accountable issue. That shouldn't even be viewed in a bad way because remember, we're all familiar with the Hawthorne Experiment. That was very positive. I mean, I hope I'm getting the name right. It was the Hawthorne Experiment, I think, right? Where the employees, when being watched, productivity soared because they felt, hey, someone was paying attention to them. I think that's the gist of that, as I recall from my college classes a long, long time ago.
Yeah, exactly. There is, the more we have interaction, and this is one of the things that we'll teach folks, is set up I'll give my recommendation for, the free tool here. You can set this up on a Google Doc. But every day, if you have a Google Doc, let's just say you create a Word doc with a couple of columns. And let's say you have 10 employees. So you create a Google Doc with 10 columns, 11 columns actually, and then each employee gets a column. And every day, every employee goes through and they just type into their particular column what their top priorities are for the day. What are the things that they have to accomplish today that they have to work on? And then you write your big accomplishment, the things that you have to accomplish today. That goes in your column. So you've each got a list of, 5, 10 items that are your top priorities for the day. Throughout the day, you can actually pop into that doc and actually keep it open all day and watch people as they check things off their list, as they add new things to their list, as they cross things out on their list. You can watch them, edit it real time.
And you're saying that's on a spreadsheet, on a Google spreadsheet, right?
Yes, or the Google Doc, either the spreadsheet or the doc, either one, it works fine. And And what it does is it creates a sense of transparency that, you know what, everyone on the team, all 10 of us, myself included, me as the manager, all of us are going to have access to each other's to-do list. We're going to be able to see what the other person is working on. And it starts to become obvious pretty quickly who's doing what work, who's accomplishing things, who's left the same to-do on their list for 4 days in a row now, who hasn't entered the Google Doc to make changes to it, because you as the owner of the document can see who's been in there to make corrections, to make additions, changes, etc. And it's just a wonderful way. Not only does it actually give you some visibility into what people are doing, but it is also a symbol of transparency. It says, I'm open. I'm sharing with you what I'm working on. I expect you to share with me what you're working on. We are all transparent here. And even though we can't necessarily physically see each other, we can see what everybody else is doing. And that's how we're going to hold each other accountable.
There was an interesting article I just read the other day, and when you talked about Rome with your rather unusual answer to my question, which I thought was great, there was an article I saw the other day that talked about remote capitals, government capitals, remote capitals and capitals that were in the thick of things like Washington, D.C., that were right there where people had access. And they talked about and compared which ones were likely to be more corrupt or less corrupt. And it was kind of counterintuitive, because the first thought was that a government capital that is in the thick of things, where everybody has easy access to it, means that all the lobbyists and the special interests, which tend to be somewhat corrupt, if not completely corrupt, but that's a political debate maybe, they would corrupt the politicians more because they had easy access to them. And it turns out that the opposite was actually true, that the more distant capitals were more corrupt because people couldn't keep an eye on things. The media wasn't there. The media, wasn't being the watchdog as much as they would in a capital that's easily accessible. And, that's kind of applies to your example of Rome and the remote or the co-located in-house employees. I think that's an interesting lesson, really.
It absolutely is. There is, as much as we go, the remote and the offshoring and all of that has become the movement. The reality is that there are lots of companies actually taking work back in country again, and it's for many of these reasons. It is, as competition increases the costs. We typically think of competition decreasing the cost, but what's happened is as their workforces, as say, for example, in India, they grow, develop, they start getting on, the world stage. Now it's not unusual to find Chinese companies, for example, outsourcing to companies in the Philippines. And, so it what goes around comes around. And so what ends up happening then is we find out, well, there were actually advantages to having this stuff be close to us. There were advantages to doing it that way. And, and so you start to see companies move it back in again. And bit by bit, we come to find that there is really a balance. There is something to be said for having control and being able to keep an eye on what's really going on. And sometimes visibility makes a difference. And in fact, it's generally become acknowledged now that if you're going to have somebody who is really vested in helping the organization achieve something, that is, we don't just want them to, create this illustration or create this little segment of code, but actually help us innovate and start thinking about this. Well, in those cases, generally speaking, there has to be some face time at some point, that no matter how remote they are, you can get stuff off your plate, the stuff that is really not terribly important, and send it overseas. But if you're going to have somebody help you innovate your next big product, at some point, we're going to need a relationship with them so we can build enough of a bond that we can start to anticipate each other's thoughts. And that is easier to create face-to-face than it is remotely.
Sure it is, yeah. Hey, last question for you. What has changed about remote employees in the past? You said it sort of got into full swing about 10 years ago. What has changed in those 10 years?
One of the big changes has been that we have technology that enables more frequency of communication. It's not without hiccups, to be sure, but we've created more technologies that have tried to create a co-located feel And it's interesting when you take a look at what are all the major advancements. Well, they all have to do with video, and you look at like Cisco's telepresence and things like that. They're all trying to create a co-located feel while still having distances across. So in today's remote world, we don't have to be completely out of touch with each other. And in fact, that's why the technology has moved in the direction it's moved in. Even something like Facebook is all about encouraging people to spend time on the site and have frequent communications back and forth. That's the essence of it. And that's been the real big change, is that it's not just you're remote, now I don't have to think about you, you don't think about me. It's remote is more, we're separated by distance, but we still want the communication to be frequent and regular. And look, I can still see you even.
Fantastic. Well, Mark Murphy, give out your website and tell people where they can get the book as well.
The website is leadershipiq.com, and we've got a number of studies and articles and white papers and whatnot on the site that are all there for free. And the book is available on Amazon. It's available Barnes & Noble, basically anywhere and everywhere.
Fantastic. Mark Murphy, Leadership IQ, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This was great fun.
This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company, all rights reserved. For distribution or publication rights and media interviews, please visit www.hartmanmedia.com or email media@hartmanmedia.com. Nothing on this show should be considered specific personal or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own, and the host is acting on behalf of Platinum Properties Investor Network, Inc. exclusively.